What does it actually mean when a government's top spokesman dies in a car crash? On the same week, fighters are ambushing troops 200 kilometers away, and nobody in charge will show their face in public. Before we get into why all three of those things are connected, hit subscribe so you catch the next update on this story before anyone else does. Like this video if you think a country this important deserves more than a 30-second headline. And share it with someone who thinks the Iran story ended back in the spring, because it really, really didn't. Let's start with the crash, because it's the most recent piece of this puzzle, and it's genuinely strange. On the night of June 29th, on a stretch of highway between the cities of Yazd and Kerman in southeastern Iran, a vehicle carrying a senior Revolutionary Guard Navy official flipped over. The man inside, Rear Admiral Mohammed Akbarzadeh, the political deputy and spokesperson for the IRGC Navy, was pulled from the wreckage alive and rushed to a nearby medical center where he died from his injuries within hours. Iranian state media called it exactly what it looked like on paper: a car accident. Investigators were reportedly sent to check road conditions, mechanical failure, possible speeding. Nothing more to see, according to Tehran. Except this was the same man who had spent months standing in front of cameras threatening to close the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most economically important waterways on the planet, and who had been personally sanctioned by the European Union just weeks earlier for his role in restricting freedom of navigation there. And it happened during almost the exact same run of days that Kurdish fighters in the mountains of western Iran were clashing with Iranian security forces in multiple separate locations, towns called Pave, Baneh, Marivan, and Mahabad, spread across roughly 200 kilometers of rugged Zagros mountain terrain, all within the same short window of time. Iranian personnel were killed in more than one of those clashes. If you think the war between Iran, Israel, and the United States ended cleanly back in the spring, and that this particular story is finished, you haven't been watching closely enough. Because right now, in the first days of August, multiple fronts inside and around Iran are quietly heating back up at the same time, and almost nobody outside the region is connecting these pieces together in real time. To understand why a highway accident and a series of mountain clashes matter this much, you need the timeline that actually got us here, because none of this appeared out of nowhere. On February 28th of this year, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated military campaign against Iran after Tehran refused to halt its uranium enrichment program. The strikes targeted Iran's ballistic missile capability, its naval assets, its air defenses, and its top leadership directly. Among those killed in the opening hours was Iran's supreme leader, the man who had ruled the Islamic Republic with near total authority since 1989, at 86 years old. Iran's assembly of experts moved quickly to name a successor, installing the late leader's own son as the new supreme leader roughly a week later. Iran retaliated with missile and drone strikes against Israel, against American bases across the region, and briefly against shipping near the Strait of Hormuz. The fighting continued for weeks, rattling oil markets and pulling in mediators from Pakistan and elsewhere, before both sides eventually agreed to a ceasefire framework that spring, one that has been tested, stretched, and repeatedly violated by both sides ever since. That ceasefire has been anything but clean. Since it was first declared, it's reportedly been broken by both sides on multiple occasions, with strikes, drone incidents, and disputed troop movements periodically threatening to unravel it entirely before either government managed to formalize anything more permanent. Pakistan helped broker an initial framework in early April, and it was extended indefinitely later that same month rather than being allowed to lapse back into open warfare. Multiple rounds of proposals moved through regional mediators in the weeks that followed, eventually touching Iran's nuclear program, its missile stockpiles, the future of the Strait of Hormuz, and the broader question of sanctions relief. Iran spent weeks publicly denying that direct negotiations with Washington were even happening, insisting instead that its foreign ministry was merely reviewing proposals passed along through third-party mediators, a distinction that mattered enormously to a government whose domestic legitimacy has long depended on never appearing to negotiate directly with the United States under pressure. That specific distinction, negotiating directly versus simply reviewing proposals passed along by a third party, might sound like a technicality to an outside observer, but inside Iran, it carries real political weight. For decades, the Islamic Republic has built part of its identity around refusing to sit across the table from Washington as equals, admitting to direct talks, even quiet, practical ones, focused entirely on de-escalation, risks handing hardliners inside the government a powerful accusation to level at anyone associated with the process. That's part of why so much of this negotiation has unfolded through intermediaries, careful public language, and studied ambiguity about who's actually talking to whom, even while the underlying substance of the deal keeps moving forward regardless. That process eventually produced something genuinely significant. On June 17th, Iran and the United States signed a memorandum of understanding aimed at turning the fragile truce into something more lasting. The broad outline is almost hard to believe coming from a government that has built its entire modern identity around defiance of the West. Iran would end uranium enrichment entirely. It would allow destruction of its existing enriched stockpiles. It would accept limits on the range of its missile arsenal. It would agree to a defined framework governing the Strait of Hormuz. In exchange, the United States would lift sanctions, unfreeze Iranian assets, and let Iran sell oil on international markets again. Under that memorandum, both sides are supposed to reach a final signed deal by August 18th. That's barely 2 weeks from right now. A memorandum of understanding isn't a treaty. It's a promise to keep talking. And nearly every day since it was signed, something has happened somewhere in or around Iran that puts that exact promise under fresh strain. Here's where the Kurdish piece of this puzzle becomes essential, because this isn't some brand new development that appeared the moment the shooting with Israel and America slowed down. Kurds make up somewhere around 10 to 12% of Iran's entire population, concentrated along that rugged western border region for centuries. They've been in some form of conflict with the Islamic Republic since practically the moment it was founded in 1979, when the country's revolutionary leadership effectively declared war on any notion of Kurdish autonomy. This isn't a population with warm feelings toward Tehran, but what makes the current moment genuinely different from every prior flare-up over the past 4.5 decades comes down to one word: organization. It's worth understanding just how fractured this movement had historically been before this year, because that context is what makes February's announcement so significant. These same 5 parties have existed for decades, sometimes competing for the same recruits, sometimes disagreeing sharply over ideology, strategy, or simply who should lead a unified Kurdish movement if one ever formed. Outside observers, including American policymakers who've studied the region for years, had long treated that fragmentation as one of the primary reasons a serious Kurdish challenge to Tehran never fully materialized, no matter how much underlying grievance existed. Watching those same organizations set that history aside and formally unite, under real pressure and on a real timeline, is exactly the kind of development that changes how seriously outside governments start taking a movement they'd previously written off as too divided to matter. On February 22nd, just 6 days before the war with the United States and Israel even began, 5 major Iranian Kurdish political parties formally unified under a single new coalition, uniting groups that had spent decades operating separately and at times even working against one another into one coordinated political and military structure with a shared, explicit objective: overthrow the Islamic Republic and secure genuine Kurdish self-determination. The coalition brings together 5 distinct organizations, each with its own history on that mountainous battlefield. The Kurdistan Free Life Party and its armed wing operate out of the Kandil mountain range along the Iran-Iraq border, with units that reportedly include women serving directly in combat roles. The Democratic Party of Iranian Kurdistan is the oldest of the group, founded back in 1945, carrying decades of institutional memory from fighting both the Shah's government before the revolution and the Islamic Republic afterward. The Kurdistan Freedom Party, founded in 1991, brings real combat experience from the fight against ISIS and was already striking guard positions in western provinces well before this year's larger war began. 2 more established Kurdish organizations round out the coalition, each adding decades of territorial knowledge and manpower to the group's overall reach. Analysts estimate the combined coalition fields somewhere in the range of a couple thousand fighters based across the border inside Iraq's semi-autonomous Kurdistan region, with established infiltration routes running directly back into the Zagros Mountains. These aren't amateurs improvising with hunting rifles. These are people who know every ravine, every ridgeline, and every checkpoint across that entire stretch of contested terrain. If you're finding this clearer than the usual chaos you see about this region online, drop a comment telling me which part of this timeline you didn't already know, because that tells me exactly where to go deeper next time. Their standard weapons loadout is still relatively conventional. Light infantry gear, rifles, rocket-propelled grenades, mortars, nothing exotic on paper. But there's one piece of modern battlefield technology that fundamentally changes the math here, and that's cheap first-person view drones. The same low-cost kamikaze drones that reshaped the entire war in Ukraine have been steadily proliferating across the Middle East. And a lightly equipped infantry unit armed with drone swarms and overhead surveillance can realistically hold ground against far more heavily armored forces in ways that rifles and mortars alone never could. Mountains already create natural choke points. Add cheap eyes in the sky that let fighters watch an entire valley without ever climbing the ridge to see it. And a conventional military force built around armored vehicles and fixed checkpoints suddenly finds itself fighting on terrain and against technology that increasingly favors the other side. That shift matters more than it might sound like at first. For most of the last 4 decades, Iran's security forces held a decisive technological advantage over Kurdish fighters operating with little beyond small arms and local knowledge of the terrain. Cheap commercial drone technology has quietly narrowed that gap in a way that doesn't require a foreign government to hand over sophisticated weapon systems or provide direct training. A drone that costs a few $100s and can be assembled from parts available through ordinary commercial suppliers now gives a small mobile unit surveillance and strike capability that used to require a helicopter or a much larger conventional force to replicate. That's part of why analysts studying this conflict keep returning to the same point. Even without the formal government-level backing that reportedly got shelved back in March, this coalition may simply be more capable on its own than any previous generation of Kurdish resistance inside Iran ever was. Now here's the part of the story involving a question almost nobody in power seems willing to answer directly. During the height of the Spring War, it was reported that the American president told a wire service he would be entirely supportive if Kurdish forces wanted to move against the Iranian regime, and that their objective should be nothing less than victory. Around that same period, separate reporting indicated Israel was actively backing plans for Iranian Kurdish militias to seize territory along the border. Analysts in Washington noted that the opening phase of the joint military campaign had already done what they described as the shaping work, hitting Iranian positions along the border and degrading exactly the command structures, air defenses, and logistics networks that had previously kept Kurdish activity contained. For a brief window that spring, every piece genuinely appeared to be lining up for a coordinated cross-border offensive. A newly unified Kurdish coalition, a sitting American president publicly cheering them on, reported Israeli backing and degraded Iranian defenses in precisely the terrain these fighters know better than anyone else on earth. And then, according to regional reporting, it got shut down from the outside. Turkey's president reportedly pressed his American counterpart directly to abandon the formal plan to arm Iranian Kurdish opposition groups, after details of that plan allegedly leaked from inside the White House itself. Turkey has obvious long-standing reasons to fear a strengthened, unified Kurdish coalition sitting directly on Iran's border, given the well-documented ties between one of these groups and a separate organization Turkey has fought inside its own borders for decades and formally designates as a terrorist organization. So a tangle of cross-border politics effectively put the brakes on Kurdish forces before any officially sanctioned offensive ever got moving. Which brings us directly to the question that should actually be keeping people up at night. If the externally backed, officially sanctioned plan got killed off back in March, how exactly is this same coalition running coordinated, simultaneous attacks across 200 kilometers of mountainous terrain right now, apparently without any of the formal outside backing that supposedly got canceled months earlier? Did something quietly restart behind closed doors without ever being announced? Or did these fighters simply reach their own breaking point entirely on their own initiative, independent of whatever Washington or Tel Aviv decided back in the spring? The honest answer, based on the numbers, increasingly looks like the second option, and those numbers are genuinely brutal. Since the war began in February, Iran and Iran-aligned militia forces have reportedly launched more than 850 separate attacks against Kurdish opposition targets, including strikes deep inside Iraq's own semi-autonomous Kurdistan region, killing civilians and wounding dozens more in the process. 850 attacks against a population that has already lived under generations of suspicion, surveillance, and periodic repression. At a certain point, people who have been fighting this exact fight for decades stop waiting for permission from foreign capitals and start making their own calculations about when the moment has actually arrived. The clashes making headlines over recent weeks bear that out in granular detail. Iranian Kurdish media accounts reported armed confrontations spreading across different parts of what Kurds call Rojalat, or Iranian Kurdistan, including an attack targeting Iranian military and security positions near Paveh in Kermanshah province. Iran's own Guard-affiliated news agency confirmed that 2 of its members were killed and 2 more injured in what it described as an armed terrorist attack. Around the same general timeline, the Guard separately announced what it called a counterterrorism operation in West Azerbaijan province, along the border with Iraq's Kurdistan region, claiming a 6-member infiltration team had been completely destroyed. The Kurdish group involved disputed that framing entirely, stating that 4 of its own fighters were killed in clashes near Mahabad, describing them as having resisted until the end. Earlier in June, a Kurdish militia's armed wing accused the Revolutionary Guard of opening artillery and mortar fire on its positions near Merevin, starting on June 8th, describing its own response as purely defensive. Iranian officials didn't publicly respond to those specific casualty claims. Analysts studying this pattern are careful to note that a handful of clashes spread across several weeks doesn't by itself prove a fully coordinated insurgency is underway. But the geographic spread, The involvement of multiple named Kurdish factions and the sheer frequency of these incidents suggests Iran's western borderlands are becoming a genuine new pressure point at precisely the moment the regime is trying to project internal control and finalize a deal with Washington. It's worth being honest about something else here, too, because it makes this story more complicated rather than less. Kurdish opposition to Tehran isn't universal. There are Kurds who serve within Iran's own government and security forces, and Kurdish parties have historically had real disagreements with one another over strategy and leadership. Any sustained Kurdish uprising risks pitting Kurds against other Kurds, not just against the regime, which is exactly the kind of internal fracture Tehran has historically tried to exploit whenever unrest along that border starts to build momentum. That complexity doesn't make the current wave of violence any less real, but it does mean this isn't a simple unified front marching in lockstep, and anyone telling you otherwise is oversimplifying a genuinely messy situation. It isn't just the Kurds either, and this is the part that should make the bigger picture click into place. On June 29th, resistance cells reportedly launched a coordinated campaign of posters, graffiti, and open calls for regime change across Tehran, Isfahan, and other major interior cities, timed to overlap with an opposition summit held outside Paris, where exiled Iranian opposition leadership described the regime as having reached what they called its last stop, pointing specifically to the appointment of a largely unseen new supreme leader as a sign of terminal weakness rather than strength. So you now have two separate pressure campaigns running simultaneously: an armed insurgency along the western border, and visible, openly defiant resistance activity operating inside major interior cities at the same time. That isn't the profile of a regime in firm control of its own territory. That's the profile of a regime playing defense on considerably more fronts than it currently has the hands to cover. If this is starting to feel like a much bigger story than a single car accident, stay with me, because the next part connects everything together, and it's the piece almost no other coverage puts in the same place, which brings the story back around to that highway between Yazd and Kerman, and to a pattern researchers who study Iran closely have already documented extensively. Iran has a long, well-established habit of attributing sensitive, high-profile deaths inside its own ranks to accidents or natural causes, specifically in situations where publicly admitting an actual targeted strike would force a mandatory, visible retaliation the regime either cannot deliver right now or does not want to risk delivering. If Akbarzade's death was in fact the result of a targeted operation, and Tehran admitted that publicly, hardliners inside the country would expect an immediate, forceful response, or the regime would start looking dangerously weak in front of its own population at the exact moment it's trying to project strength through a massive state funeral. Calling it a routine car accident sidesteps that entire problem in one move. No admission, no expectation of payback, no appearance of losing control. This isn't a theoretical pattern either. Iran has quietly relied on nearly identical framing before, in cases involving other officials whose deaths came at politically inconvenient moments, choosing ambiguous language over a clear public accusation nearly every time the alternative would have forced a response the government wasn't prepared to deliver. That consistency is exactly why so many analysts reacted to this specific crash with immediate skepticism, rather than simply accepting the official account at face value. Skepticism, it's worth stressing clearly, is not the same thing as proof. Nobody outside a very small circle currently knows with certainty what actually happened on that highway, and it's entirely possible the official explanation is simply true. It's also worth noting, in fairness to that official explanation, that Akbarzadeh wasn't the only senior Guard Navy figure to die violently this year. The actual commander of the Guard Navy was reportedly killed back in April during a joint Israeli-American strike, targeting guard positions near Bandar Abbas, a confirmed military strike with no ambiguity attached to it whatsoever. Akbarzadeh's death, by contrast, has no confirmed cause beyond the official account of a highway rollover, and Iranian authorities have publicly stated only that an investigation into the circumstances is ongoing. Whether this genuinely was a random accident or something else entirely may simply never be confirmed one way or the other, and that unresolved uncertainty is precisely the kind of gap Iran's information environment is built to leave open. Now zoom all the way out, because this naval officer's death and the mounting clashes are just two threads inside a much larger, considerably more complicated picture. All of this has been unfolding in the direct shadow of an even bigger, unresolved story: the identity and visibility of the man technically running the country. The new supreme leader was named successor within roughly a week of his father's death back in February, reportedly wounded in those same opening strikes and effectively operating from a position of relative concealment ever since. As of the first days of August, he still hasn't made a substantial public appearance since taking the position. Iran spent the following weeks staging an enormous multi-city funeral for the slain former leader, spanning several major cities domestically and stretching into Iraq as well. Multiple regional analysts have pointed out that the timing of that funeral spectacle appeared deliberately arranged to overlap with the United States, marking 250 years since its founding, a detail that, whether coincidental or intentional, hasn't gone unnoticed by observers watching how carefully the regime is managing its public image right now. So stack every one of these threads up in your head at the same time. A regime staging a massive funeral spectacle designed to project national unity to millions of mourners, while the man, technically now in charge of the entire country, won't show his face publicly. A senior naval commander, dead under circumstances Iran insists were purely accidental and refuses to speculate on further. A coordinated multi-province Kurdish insurgency that has escalated steadily since February, backed by a formal 5-party political coalition that organized itself 6 days before the shooting even started. Resistance cells now openly painting anti-regime slogans in the streets of the capital itself. And underneath every one of those threads, a fragile, unfinished negotiation process with Washington that both governments claim they still genuinely want, even as it keeps getting tested by exactly this kind of violence, week after week. And the tension hasn't been standing still. Just days before this recording, exiled Iranian Kurdish rebel groups stated that Iran launched more than a dozen separate drones targeting their positions inside Iraqi Kurdistan, causing material damage on the ground. In direct response, the United States and Saudi Arabia reportedly carried out joint military strikes against Iran-backed militias operating inside Iraq. That's not the behavior of two governments quietly coasting toward a peaceful final settlement. That's two governments still actively exchanging fire through proxies, while their diplomats keep insisting, at least publicly, that a final deal is still within reach before the August 18th deadline arrives. So what actually happens over these final 2 weeks of this negotiating window matters enormously, and right now nobody outside a very small circle actually knows the answer. Does the negotiation track genuinely hold, with both governments ultimately deciding a finalized, signed deal is worth more than whatever pride either side would lose by putting their names on it? Or does one of these smaller ongoing fires finally spiral out of anyone's control? An ambush that goes further than intended, a suspicious death that eventually gets traced conclusively back to a foreign intelligence operation, a domestic crackdown that finally tips over into genuine nationwide unrest. Any one of those could plausibly reignite the exact war this fragile ceasefire was supposed to have already ended for good. Nobody watching from the outside actually knows which way this breaks, and anyone confidently telling you they do is guessing. What we do know with real confidence is the sheer amount of pressure stacking up on every side of this at once. A fractured, largely invisible chain of command. At the very top of the Iranian state, a funeral built for public spectacle rather than genuine national mourning. An insurgency spreading across multiple provinces along the western border simultaneously. A suspicious death that Tehran clearly doesn't want examined too closely by anyone. And a negotiation running against a hard deadline with the very countries that killed the regime's own head of state just 5 months ago. That's an enormous amount of accumulated weight for any government to carry at once, let alone a government this visibly wounded and this visibly uncertain of its own leadership. It's worth remembering that governments rarely collapse because of a single dramatic event that historians can later point to as the obvious turning point. More often, they weaken gradually, under exactly this kind of accumulated pressure, absorbing one blow after another until something finally gives, sometimes in a way that looks sudden from the outside, even though the underlying strain had been building for months. Whether that's what's happening inside Iran right now is genuinely impossible to say with confidence from the outside. But the sheer number of simultaneous pressure points here, military, political, and symbolic all at once, is not something this government has had to manage in this particular combination before. And on the other side of the equation, you have a Kurdish coalition that spent years being told outside support was finally coming, watched that formal support reportedly get pulled at the last possible minute over Turkish objections, and is now operating on its own initiative, apparently unbothered by whatever calculations Washington or Tel Aviv made back in March. You have resistance cells openly painting slogans on walls in the capital city itself. You have a supreme leader that essentially nobody outside a small inner circle has actually seen since taking power. And you have global shipping and oil markets still watching the Strait of Hormuz with one eye open at all times, waiting to see whether this fragile calm genuinely holds through August 18th, or whether the next single incident is the one that sends everything spiking right back into open conflict. Global energy markets have already shown exactly how sensitive they are to every twist in this story. Oil prices spiked sharply in the immediate aftermath of the February strikes, eased once the ceasefire took hold that spring, and have continued jumping on every fresh headline out of the Zagros Mountains or the Strait of Hormuz ever since, because traders understand precisely what a genuinely disorderly collapse of this fragile arrangement would mean for global shipping and global supply. None of that market sensitivity is abstract either. Every time a headline breaks about a new clash along the western border or a fresh incident near the strait, someone somewhere is adjusting a shipping insurance premium, rerouting a tanker, or recalculating a fuel budget for the months ahead, often long before any government official has said a single word publicly about what actually happened. That's the quiet, unglamorous way a story like this one reaches ordinary people far outside the region through fuel prices and shipping costs that shift before most people ever hear the underlying news that caused them to move. Every one of these threads is genuinely dangerous, entirely on its own. Together, they add up to a foundation with far more visible cracks running through it than any state funeral broadcast or any carefully worded diplomatic statement out of Tehran is willing to openly admit. Here's the honest question worth sitting with as we wrap up. Do all of these individual cracks stay contained and quietly managed, the same way Tehran managed the story of a dead naval commander? Or does one of them finally widen enough to bring meaningful parts of that entire structure down at once? Keep an eye on the Zagros Mountains. Keep an eye on whatever comes out of Washington and Tehran in the days leading up to August 18th. And keep watching to see whether the man technically running Iran right now ever actually shows his face in public. Because whichever one of these threads snaps first is very likely going to shape what the rest of this year looks like for the entire Middle East. And for anyone whose daily life is quietly connected to the price of oil, the safety of a shipping lane, most people have never thought twice about, or the fragile peace of a region that's already been pushed right to the edge once this year. None of these threads exist in isolation. And that's really the point worth carrying away from all of this. A car accident on a desert highway, a coalition of exiled parties finally setting aside decades of rivalry, a leader nobody has seen, a deadline 2 weeks away. Individually, any one of those might read as a regional footnote. Together, they read as a government being tested from every direction at once, at precisely the moment it can least afford. What do you think happens first, a signed deal or another crack in the wall? Tell me in the comments and subscribe to see which one actually happens.